Hello, and welcome to Aerial Perspective Effects in Photoshop. I'm Varis, your host for this adventure. In this tutorial, I'm going to be looking at a technique for enhancing the sense of space and bringing subjects forward to separate them from the background. The basic concept here is about manipulating contrast. Photographs are really records of the lights and darks in a scene. The illusion of three dimensions in a two-dimensional photo is created by the highlights and shadows that define the objects in the scene. Things that have more contrast tend to move forward, and things with less contrast move back. This principle has been used in art for over 1,000 years and is generally referred to as aerial perspective. Starting roughly in 900 AD, Chinese landscape painters developed a very sophisticated spatial effect by fading things into the distance. Here, we can clearly see the progression from near to far, starting with the dark contrast of the trees and progressively lighter and softer contrast of the temple, mountains, and what appears to be a very distant waterfall. The real world does not always cooperate fully with this effect. In this photograph, I wanted to have more separation between the mineral tufa structures here at Mono Lake and the mountains behind them. The solution was to create a mist effect which pushes the mountains further into the background. Here we have a very chaotic scene with the medieval reenactors merging with figures close behind them. Similarly, by blowing some dust into the scene, I can separate the combatants from the spectators to clarify the action. You don't always have to use smoke. In this case, the contrast in the background was dramatically lowered with a curve adjustment masked off of the foreground group. Here I used a motion blur effect to isolate the capoeira musicians from their background. We're going to go into Photoshop to examine step by step the process that gets me from here to here. Along the way, we'll be learning about the shadows highlights adjustment, paths, selections, and layer masks, using a high pass filter on an overlay layer to snap the highlights, how to use the clouds filter to create dust, and use a screen layer to create beams of light. Okay, so take a deep breath, turn off your phone, and let's begin. All right, here we are, and this image, as it is now, is underexposed, and I need to kind of fix that, but the background is actually properly exposed. The bright ground in the back here, the camera has compensated for that brightness and underexposed the overall image. And we need to bring them closer together. We want the foreground to come up in brightness and perhaps darken that background a little bit. And this suggests that we use shadow highlight. So we got to fix the biggest problem first. So we're going to fix that shadowy look by brightening it up with a shadow highlight adjustment. So I'm going to duplicate the background first, and then I'm going to use image adjustments, shadows highlights. Okay, so now I always have this open this way, showing more options. By default, it opens up like this. If you've never used it before, you'll see this dialog, and you do want to show more options, so just check that little box and the dialog will open up like this. These are the default settings, and we don't have to accept them. Usually this amount is too high. A lot of times we don't need to brighten the image that much. Here it's doing quite a bit. It's actually quite effective at brightening this shadowy subject. I'm actually going to brighten it up even more here. So perhaps maybe even something like this. The tonal width is sort of the breakpoint where the Photoshop considers part of the image shadow and part of it highlights, and by default it's set right in the middle. I think that works well for us here. If I move it to the left, less of the image is considered a shadow, and so it's going to have less of an effect, a lightening effect. And I can kind of play around with this to just see, if more of the image is considered a shadow, then it will brighten everything up. Let's see if I go to 100%. So it looks to me like 50% is good here, so I'm just going to go ahead and leave that there. The radius setting is kind of how we preserve local contrast in the image. Higher radius settings, once you stop making, you can kind of see lack of detail. Here, if I go all the way to the left, you see it's flattened out. I don't have any local contrast in there. As I move it up, it reaches a point where I stop, I get a sort of diminishing returns here, and that's looks like in this image is pretty close to 30 pixels, which is their default, so I'll leave it there. Now moving down in the highlights area, I can increase the amount to darken the highlights. So we'll do that just a little bit to kind of darken down that bright ground back there. Now I'm bringing both the highlights and the shadows closer together. Ultimately, I'm going to actually want to separate these foreground figures from the background, but right now I want to bring the tonal range of both background and the figures closer together. This adjustment down here, the color correction, is really adding saturation. This image started off as very shadowy. As things are closer to black, they have less saturation. So when we brighten them up, we usually want to add a little saturation to the colors. And in this case, since their clothing is fairly colorful, I might like to add just even a little bit more. So I'm going to boost that up a little bit, and we get a little more color into the vest here, and it's bringing out the green in the leaves of the tree. So that's good. The midtone contrast is an additional control for adding a little more sort of local contrast into these what were shadow and highlight regions. So I'll just pump that up just a little bit there. These little curious fields down here, the black clip and white clip, are less obvious. So perhaps we'll have a little discussion of that. I'm going to zoom in here to this section just so we can kind of see the effect of that. Okay, so the black clip is where it sort of puts a black point into the image, and the default is fairly low because very small moves in this will have a dramatic effect. We can kind of increase the value here using the kind of scrubby brush here. If I place the cursor right over a black clip here, I get that little side-to-side arrow indicating that I can now move the values in that field just by scrubbing. So if I go up and I increase that quite a bit, it darkens the darkest things in the image, and you can see very, very subtle effects here. If I went ahead and just hammered it with, say, a large value, you can see that it will actually increase the black point here, make things blacker. But we'll put this back to 0.01. And similarly with the white, if we increase this value, highlight areas will clip to white faster. So if I jump in there with a big value, see these areas that are close to highlights get pushed into white very rapidly. So we don't want to do that, so we're going to put this back to our default values. Okay. I'll just kind of toggle this on and off just to make sure that it's doing what I want it to do, and okay, we're good to go. Now, ultimately, I'm going to need to build a pretty detailed mask for these figures to separate them from the background, and this type of thing is very hard to accomplish. Most people would start off with, say, the quick selection tool and try to select the figure, and the problem is going to be, when we get into these swords, And it's really difficult to get enough stuff cleanly selected here. Even though we have a very detailed edge, you can see how it sort of wants to merge with things in the background, and it's going to be very difficult here. So my inclination is not to use a little quick masking tool, but to do it old school here. And for that, I would prefer to use the pen tool. So the strategy here for the pen tool is to zoom way in, and I can kind of see, I know where this glove is. This quick select tool was going to have a hard time distinguishing between these two regions, but I can use the pen tool to start drawing a little line right inside the edge of the figure where I see it. So what I do is I click and advance these points along. As I click and drag, you see I've got this little handle thing that allows me to shape the curve that I'm drawing here along just inside the edge of this glove here. Now, it takes a little getting used to, and it takes a little skill that you have to develop, but this is well worth the effort. So when you want to do even more detailed work, you can kind of zoom in. I'm in about now at 500%, so this is pretty crazily detailed, but I can really get a very detailed edge this way. And with these swords, this is practically the only way to select this tiny. You can see there are not that many pixels in this line, and for me to effectively select that, I really do need to use the path for this. Now, I'm not going to force you to watch me build a path for this whole thing, because in fact I've already done that. So I'm going to go ahead and we'll go ahead and throw this path away, and I will load the path that I saved earlier. So here's the path, and you can kind of see how it goes just inside the edge all the way around. And yes, it takes a while, but sometimes this is just the best way to do this, especially up in here where it really gets hard to separate that sword, and we really need to have a very detailed mask here to pull off this effect. So once I have completed the path and I save it, now I can recall the path as a selection. So I can highlight the path and then say make selection here, and we'll give it a 1 pixel feather. On a higher res image, I'd actually give it more of a feather. You will notice that when you're really zoomed in at 100 or 200%, edges are not that sharp. So you don't want to create an artificially sharp edge. In this case, 1 pixel feather will be fine for this particular image. So I say OK, and now we have a selection. Now I would save that selection. Okay. And that will make an alpha channel, a new channel, that will be our mask. Okay, so I've actually saved this before, and just for clarity, I'm going to throw away one of the masks just so I only have one here. Okay, so that's where we save the selection, and now I can drop the selection and recall it later when I need it. So right now I would like to actually add some additional contrast into these foreground figures. And the way I'm going to do that is using a high pass overlay layer. So we'll duplicate the background again. And this is going to be my highlights. So this is the step for creating a high pass layer to use for highlight snapping. I'm going to run the hue saturation adjustment directly on this layer. So instead of making a layer mask or an adjustment layer, I'm going to actually run hue saturation directly on the image to desaturate it. There's my hue saturation, and I'm just going to desaturate the whole thing to make a black and white. Now, to help in visualizing the final effect, it's useful to convert this to a smart object. So I've already desaturated it. Right now I'm going to convert it to a smart object, and this allows me to undo filters or stack multiple filters and redo them without multiple iterations that might damage the file. It also gives me a way of previewing an effect that's difficult to preview. So right now it's a smart object, and that means I can run filters on this, and they're sort of undoable, and I can return to the filter dialog later and change a setting, and we'll see how that all works here. So I'm going to run a filter here, filter other high pass, and we'll get our little dialog window here. So high pass is kind of an interesting filter that if we have a very low radius, we have mostly gray image. And as I increase the radius, it starts to emphasize tonal transitions. So at very low radius, it's sort of highlighting just the edges of things. And if we get in here higher and higher, we start to see more and more detail in the image. And so what I'm looking for is kind of an amount that gives me sort of a bas relief effect, where it looks, I'm getting more of that three-dimensionality back into the image. So if I'm up here, looking to me like in this sort of maybe 15 pixel range or so, that's giving me good little detail in the sleeves, and these highlights are starting to show up. Okay, so I'm going to say OK. So the way we're ultimately going to use this is by changing the apply mode for this layer to overlay, and that gives us this kind of enhanced contrast effect. But I don't want the dark part of this contrast. I don't want these things to get real dark and crunchy looking. What I really want is just the highlight part of this, the highlight emphasis. So the trick here is we're going to go and change the blending options for this layer. We have it in overlay mode, but there's advanced blending options that we can get to here from the layer options flyway. So I go to advanced blending options, and I get this dialog. Okay. What we're concerned with here is this blend if area. This layer is that gray overlay layer, the high pass layer. And I want to take the dark half of that layer out of the equation, because this dark half that's causing the darkening effect down here. So I use a little black slider and I move it all the way to 128, because that's the breakpoint here in the overlay effect. So everything darker than 128 is darkening the underlying image. So I've just eliminated that darkening effect. And if we can preview this on and off, and you can see how the dark edges kind of disappear now when I remove it using this black slider. So now I'm only pinging the highlights, but I only want to do that to the figures. And I may, now that I've got this here in the effect, I can kind of return to the filter. But before I do that, I'm going to actually make a mask. So I'm going to return to our saved path. This was saved as an alpha channel here. And I can hold down the Command or Control key and click on it, and it will load it back as a selection. Now that I have this layer highlighted, all I have to do is click on the layer mask icon to add that selection into the layer mask, which of course takes the sort of highlight snapping effect off the background. And now that I've isolated this and I can look at the figures, I may want to come back in here by double clicking on that high pass filter, which is stacked because it's now a smart filter applied to a smart object. I can now get this dialog again and see what the overlay effect is doing. And maybe I change my my radius settings here, or find something that I can see I can preview the effect more effectively. So actually it looks like I needed to add maybe a little higher radius to get the effect that I was looking for. Okay. So you can see how that's pinging the highlights, and it uses the sort of information in the image itself to do that. So we've added now the maximum contrast for our foreground, and now we have to add in our dust for the background, which means I'm going to have to put these figures on another layer above the background. So we're going to go ahead and do that, but now I've got this overlay highlight snapping effect in place. I want to get a merged version of this whole scene on top that has that highlight effect already in it. Okay, so what we need to do is hold down Option and Option or Alt, and when I get to my layer options flyaway here, I'm going to merge visible. But if I keep holding down Option or Alt, then this will put a merged version on the top of the layer stack. Okay, so this version of the image is exactly the same as the result of all of these layers underneath it. This is the layer that I want to mask the figures off of, and I already have a layer mask here, so all I really need to do is duplicate it into this layer, and I'll do that by holding down the Option key and just dragging it. So I drag it up. Now I've got that mask into this layer, and if I turn off the underlying layers, you can see here I've got a very nice mask. I've isolated these figures perfectly. So now it is time for the dust. So we're going to make a layer in between these two layers to hold the dust. So I'll just click on Create New Layer here at the bottom of the layer stack, and I create an empty layer. And this is going to be my dust. And before I get too far away, I'm going to make sure I label everything here. This is my figures, and this is going to hold my dust. So what I want to do is sample a color from in the image, and we'll pick a lighter color here from the light dirt, and then I'm going to hold down Option or Alt, and I'm going to see that light color went into the foreground. I'm going to pick a darker brown color, maybe something from this tree back here, and that places that brown color in the background if I click holding down the Option or Alt key. Okay. These two colors, the foreground and background color, are used when running the clouds filter. So if you have white and black in there, you're going to get white and black clouds. And we're trying to create a kind of dust cloud here. So I want it to be dust colored, which would be like the dirt. All right, so I'm going to go here to Filter, and the clouds filter is under Render. So go Filter, Render, Clouds. And you can see you get this sort of smoky, cloudy looking thing. It's filled up that whole layer with a sort of clouds based on these foreground and background colors. So now I can just reduce the opacity of this, say something like that. So we can just see it sort of smokily obscuring the background. Now, of course, it looks ridiculous right now. We have to actually enhance this a bit. We're going to use some masks here to do that. So I'm going to make a layer mask by clicking on the layer mask icon. And I'm going to put black in my foreground color and use the gradient tool to mask off regions of the image where I don't want the dust. And logically, I don't want the dust coming in front of the figures. I want it to appear like it's kind of sort of behind them somewhat. So I will use the opacity here at 100%. I'm going to use the second preset here, which is the foreground to transparent preset. Okay. Now start here, hold down the shift key, and I'm going to drag up. So it's going to start, it's going to place black in the mask and then fade it to transparent. So there I've sort of moved the dust towards the background. I do want to take it off the trees somewhat, and I'm going to reduce my opacity here because I don't want to remove it entirely, but I want to fade it from the top just a bit. And maybe this region of the trees and those are the sort of trees from that foreground tree over here. So I'm going to just sort of remove the dust cloud from that a bit. And one final little tweak here to the mask. I'm going to paint with black over this tree because this tree should be in front of the dust as well. So I'll make a nice larger size brush here, and I'm just going to mask off painting with black over this tree because that tree is in front of the dust. Okay, so we're almost there. Now I just need to create the beams of light effect. So I'll start by making some selections, and I'm just going to use the lasso tool here, and we'll start sort of drawing in lines for the beams of light. So I'm going to go ahead and sort of drag. And if you hold down the Option or Alt key, you can get a sort of rubber band selection effect. So I'm going to create kind of a shaft of light here. I'm creating sort of lines here to indicate where the beams of light are coming through the leaves, the openings in the leaves in the trees. And we'll hold down the Shift key to add to that selection because I want to have multiple beams. And so I'm holding down the Shift key and then switch and hold, not switch, but hold down the Option key again, and now I get again that sort of rubber band effect that makes it easy to draw a straight line. And I'm going to make this a very narrow beam. And I keep doing that now. I'm just going to keep adding more beams in here. And they should be running somewhat parallel. And let's add a couple more. And one more. Oops, hang on. Let's do that again. Shift to add, and then I hold down the Option key, and what I'm going to do is kind of make this beam sort of fill in that area there. Okay. All right, so these are now going to be where I'm going to have the beams of light, and we're going to create the beams of light with an additional copy of this clouds layer. So I'm going to duplicate that whole layer. It will be placed in screen mode. So I'm going to change this to screen. Here we go. And you see it brightens that up. Now, I already have a mask in this because it's an exact copy of this previous clouds layer. I don't want to destroy this mask. I want to use an additional mask. So the way you do that is by making a group. So this little icon down here that looks like a folder. That's our new group icon. I'll click on that. And I get this little folder, and you can kind of see it's sort of open, but there's nothing in it. There's nothing in it yet. I have to take this dust copy and drag it into that folder. So now it's inside that folder, and I can apply a mask to that folder. So I have this selection active here, and if I click on the layer mask icon for that group, I put the beams of light in there. Now, of course, these are hard edged, and it's not really going to work here, but it's very simple to fix that. I'm just going to run a blur filter. So I'll go filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and now I can kind of see just how blurry I want that. And you know, it seems to me that I need to have it fairly blurry, but it not so much that I obscure the beams, right? Something like that should work pretty good. Now you can kind of go back in here, and this is the same opacity as that dust, and it's added on top of itself to create the sort of more cloudy look here. We can change how strong, you know, how bright those beams are just by changing the opacity here. But that's pretty much the effect. That gets us from here, and we started off like this. So pretty dramatic improvement here. This effect is kind of cool looking. It's totally artificial, but most people that look at this don't immediately assume that it's been tricked in. And it is effectively hiding the background here without actually replacing the background with something else. I'm just adding the sense of atmosphere and space. So consider using this kind of thing to help in situations where you really want to isolate the figures from the background, but you don't want to actually replace the background with something completely different. And in this case, it's sort of a documentary image. This was taken at a historical reenactment event, and I still managed to create a much more pleasing shot than even you know, if we start back here. Even this is not as good as it is after we've added in the dust. Okay, well, I hope you like that, and stay tuned for more. You can look on my blog at blog.varis.com, and also check out my website from time to time, www.varis.com. And please sign up for my email list, and I'll let you know when I'm teaching more workshops or when I post new tutorials online. Thank you very much.